The icy water of my mother's backyard pool swallowed me whole, shocking the breath right out of my lungs. I plunged into the deep end, the sudden silence of the water wrapping around my ears like a heavy blanket. For a fraction of a second, suspended there in the cold blue, I thought about simply staying under. I thought about letting the water muffle the sounds of the people above me, the people who shared my blood but had never once treated me like family. But the human instinct to survive is stronger than the desire to give up, so I kicked my heavy, waterlogged shoes against the bottom and broke the surface. As I came up gasping for air, wiping stinging chlorine from my eyes, the sound that greeted me wasn't a gasp of concern. It wasn't my mother screaming for someone to help me. It was laughter. It started as a few scattered chuckles, and then it erupted into full, mocking, open-mouthed laughter. It echoed across the expensive patio, bouncing off the perfectly manicured hedges and the glowing string lights. My own brother, Carter, the man of the hour, was standing right at the edge of the pool with a smug, arrogant smirk plastered on his face. He didn't reach out a hand. He didn't even drop his champagne glass. Isabella, his beautiful, terrible fiancée, was practically leaning on him, her hand covering her mouth as she giggled like she was watching a clumsy clown at a circus. And then there was my mother, Denise. She stood towering over me at the edge of the concrete coping, her expensive pale blue designer dress completely dry, her makeup flawless. There was no accident in her eyes. There was no apology. She glared down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You don't belong in this picture," she hissed, her voice low enough that only I and the people immediately next to her could hear the venom, but loud enough to shatter whatever was left of my heart. "Look at you. You ruin everything." I stood there, treading water in my ruined suit, feeling a lifetime of rejection, of being the outcast, of being the family scapegoat, settled deep into my bones. The humiliation burned in my chest, hotter than the chlorine in my eyes. I was 30 years old, a grown man who had built a life for himself completely on his own, and yet here I was, reduced to a soaking wet joke for my family's entertainment. I was ready to pull myself out of that water, walk through their pristine house leaving a trail of dirty puddles, get into my car, and drive away from these people forever. I was done. I was finally, truly done. But before I could even place my hands on the wet stone to hoist myself up, the heavy, undeniable crunch of thick tires on gravel cut through the laughter. It was a sound that didn't belong in this upper-middle-class suburban neighborhood. The mocking chuckles slowly died down as the guests turned their heads toward the front of the property. Headlights cut through the twilight, sweeping across the green lawn. A massive, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided down the private driveway, ignoring the valet stand completely, and parked right at the edge of the patio gates. The silence that fell over the backyard was absolute. You could hear the water dripping off my chin. Nobody breathed. In our world, in Carter and Isabella's world, a car like that meant one thing: real, untouchable power. The driver's door opened, and a massive man in a dark suit stepped out. He walked around to the back door and pulled it open, and out stepped Daniel Mercer. He was one of the wealthiest billionaires in New York, a man who could destroy a corporate empire with a single phone call. And in a matter of seconds, he was about to step into my mother's perfectly staged evening and turn my family's entire universe upside down. Before I tell you exactly how my mother's perfect evening shattered into a million pieces, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. To understand how I ended up treading water in my best suit, being laughed at by the people who were supposed to love me, you have to understand the dynamic of my family. My name is Elijah. I am 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the ghost haunting my own home. Carter is 2 years younger than me. From the moment he was born, he was the golden child. He had my mother's bright eyes, her easy, manipulative charm, and a natural ability to tell people exactly what they wanted to hear. My mother, Denise, is a woman who lives and breathes for appearances. To her, the neighborhood gossip is gospel. She cares more about what the women at her country club think of her than she cares about her own soul. My father, Richard, checked out of parenting decades ago. Whenever my mother would start a screaming match, threatening him with a divorce over some perceived slight or financial argument. My father would just retreat to his study and close the door. He chose peace over protecting his eldest son. Because I was quiet, because I liked reading more than playing golf, and because I saw right through my mother's superficial facade, I became the enemy. I was the stain on her perfect white rug. The hardest part of growing up as the unfavored child is that you never really stop hoping they will wake up one day and love you. You keep trying to earn a seat at a table where your chair has already been permanently removed. I remember the exact moment the final nail was driven into the coffin of my childhood. It was the spring of my senior year of high school. I had been working 3 part-time jobs, flipping burgers, mowing lawns, and stocking grocery shelves, just to buy a beat-up used Honda. I walked into our kitchen one afternoon to find my mother sitting at the island, handing Carter a thick manila envelope. Carter was grinning from ear to ear. I asked what it was. My mother looked at me, completely deadpan, and told me she was giving Carter the entire college fund that my grandfather had left for both of us. "Carter needs it more, Elijah," she said, taking a sip of her coffee like she was discussing the weather. "He's going to a prestigious private university. He needs to network with the right people. You're just going to the state college. You're smart. You'll figure out the loans. Besides, Carter has potential for high-level management." She didn't even flinch. She stole my inheritance, the money my grandfather specifically meant for my education, and handed it to the golden boy to use as party money. So I figured it out. I moved away, took out massive student loans, and worked myself into the ground while Carter drank his way through a business degree that took him 5 years to finish. After college, I moved to New York City. I had no safety net, no trust fund. If I failed, I would be sleeping on the street. I started at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder at Mercer Holdings, a ruthless, incredibly successful private equity firm. My starting salary barely covered my rent in a roach-infested apartment in Queens, but I didn't care. I worked 80-hour weeks. I ate cold instant noodles at my desk at 2 in the morning. I studied every financial projection, every legal loophole, every corporate strategy until my eyes bled. While I was bleeding for my career, Carter was failing upward. My parents funded his luxury apartment. They bought him a new car. They introduced him to wealthy contacts. But Carter was inherently lazy. He kept getting fired or mutually parting ways with the companies my parents begged to hire him. Then, 7 years ago, the facade almost completely crumbled. My father made a series of terrible investments, and our family hit a massive financial wall. We were weeks away from foreclosure. My mother was absolutely hysterical, not about the prospect of being homeless, but about the neighbors finding out she was broke. She couldn't handle the shame. During that crisis, my mother did something unforgivable. She took my grandmother's antique diamond engagement ring, the only piece of real, meaningful history our family had left, a ring that was supposed to be kept safe for future generations, and she secretly pawned it. I found out when my father called me, crying, drunk on cheap whiskey, confessing what she had done. I had just received my first real, substantial bonus at Mercer Holdings. It was the money I was going to use to finally pay off a massive chunk of my student debt and maybe buy a decent mattress. Instead, I took that entire bonus in cash, took the train back to my hometown, walked into a dingy, foul-smelling pawn shop downtown, and slammed the money on the glass counter. The pawnbroker, a heavy-breathing man with grease on his shirt, handed me the ring. I drove to my parents' house, walked into the living room, and dropped the ring onto the coffee table in front of my mother. I didn't yell. I didn't ask for a thank you. I just looked her in the eye and said, "Keep it in the family." I thought, in my naive, desperate heart, that this would be the moment. This would be the moment she would look at me and realize I was a good son. A son she could be proud of. She picked up the ring, put it in her pocket, and walked out of the room. A month later, she started telling all her country club friends that Carter, sweet, successful Carter, had used the profits from his consulting business to buy the ring back and save the family's honor. She completely erased my sacrifice. She took my hard-earned money, my loyalty, and handed the credit to the golden boy. I stopped coming home after that. I stopped calling. I poured every ounce of my rage and my pain into my work at Mercer Holdings. And it paid off in ways my family couldn't even fathom. Over the next few years, I became the ultimate fixer. I was the guy who cleaned up the messes before the powerful men at the top ever had to see them. I worked directly under Daniel Mercer, the billionaire founder of the firm. Daniel is a man who speaks softly but expects absolute perfection. I gave him exactly that. I earned his respect and then I earned his trust. I was promoted rapidly, eventually becoming the executive director of strategic operations. Within the industry, I was known simply by my initials, EH. I was the final gatekeeper for Mercer Holdings. If a company wanted a multi-million-dollar investment, their files had to pass across my desk. I reviewed the numbers, the liabilities, the legal risks. If I didn't sign off on a project, Daniel Mercer didn't open his checkbook. Period. I held the power to make or break corporate empires. But back in my hometown, my mother was spinning a very different narrative. To her friends, Carter was a rising corporate titan, and I was just a lowly administrative assistant. Whenever relatives asked about me, she would sigh dramatically and say I was doing secretary work in the city, fetching coffee and filing papers. She couldn't understand my job, so she diminished it. I let her tell her lies. I didn't need her validation anymore. I had a massive salary, a penthouse apartment, and the ear of a billionaire. Then, 3 days ago, my desk phone rang. It was Julian, my cousin. Julian always played the role of the family peacemaker, though I always suspected he just liked the drama. He sounded frantic. "Elijah, you have to come down this weekend. It's Carter's engagement party. He's marrying Isabella Sterling. Aunt Denise has been crying all morning because you haven't RSVP'd. She feels terrible about how distant you two have been. Carter really wants his big brother there. Please, man, do it for the family." I deal with manipulators and liars every single day. I negotiate with corporate sharks. I should have seen right through Julian's manufactured panic. But a tiny, stupid part of my heart, the part that still remembered being a little boy wanting his mother to hug him, took the bait. I told Julian I would drive down. I didn't know who Isabella Sterling was. I didn't know that her father, Arthur Sterling, was the CEO of Sterling Logistics. And I certainly didn't know that Arthur Sterling was currently drowning in hidden debt, desperately seeking a $50 million bailout from Mercer Holdings to avoid bankruptcy. I didn't know that the very file detailing Arthur's corrupt labor practices and financial liabilities had been sitting on my desk for 3 months, waiting for my final stamp of rejection. I was walking completely blind into a trap, set by people who only saw me as an ugly prop to make their perfect family portraits look a little more charitable. The drive from New York took a little over 2 hours. I pulled up to my mother's sprawling suburban house just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the massive oak trees that lined the street. The entire property had been transformed. It looked less like a family gathering and more like a Hollywood movie set. There were valet attendants in matching red vests taking keys from guests driving BMWs and Lexuses. String lights were draped elegantly over the driveway, and a string quartet was playing softly on the front porch. I handed my keys to the valet, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored dark suit, and walked up the paved walkway. Right near the entrance, there was a massive ornate floral board resting on a gold easel. It read in flowing white script, "Carter and Isabella, welcoming the Sterling family." Beneath that, in slightly smaller letters, it said, "Hosted by Richard, Denise, and Julian." I stopped and stared at the sign. They had put my cousin's name on the welcome board, but not mine. Not the older brother. Not the eldest son. Just a blank space where my existence should have been. I felt my chest tighten, a familiar, heavy ache spreading behind my ribs. I almost turned around and walked back to my car right then and there. But I had driven 2 hours, and I wasn't going to let them think I was a coward. I took a deep breath, pasted a neutral expression on my face, and walked through the side gate toward the backyard patio. The smell of expensive grilled salmon and chlorine from the pool filled the air. Waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I recognized people I had grown up with, old neighbors, distant aunts and uncles, all dressed to the nines, laughing and sipping their drinks. Before I could even make it to the bar to get a glass of water, my mother appeared. She seemed to materialize out of thin air. She was wearing a pale blue designer dress that looked like it belonged on a runway, her hair perfectly coiffed. She stopped 3 feet away from me, her eyes sweeping up and down my dark suit. The fake, gracious smile she had been wearing for the guests vanished instantly, replaced by a hard, thin line. "You actually came," she said. "It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation." "I told Julian I would," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "Well, you're late, and I wish you had worn something a little more festive, Elijah. You look like you're heading to a funeral. And please, I am begging you, do not make tonight about yourself. The Sterlings are incredibly important people. Arthur Sterling has a massive logistics empire. Do not bore them or my friends with stories about your little administrative job in the city. Just smile, say hello, and stay out of the way. Tonight is about Carter." I looked at her, truly looked at her. The sheer audacity of her words was staggering. I ran the strategic operations for a firm that could buy Arthur Sterling's company and sell it for parts before lunch. But I didn't say it. Handing the truth to people committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of breath. I just gave her a tight, polite nod. "Understood, Mother." I walked past her and headed toward the dining area to find my seat. There was a long, breathtakingly beautiful head table set up beneath a white canopy. It was decorated with cascading white roses, crystal wine glasses, and silver plates. I saw the beautifully printed name cards. Carter, Isabella, Arthur Sterling, his wife Eleanor, my parents, and even Julian. I walked slowly down the entire length of the table. My name wasn't there. A hot flush of humiliation crept up my neck. I looked around the yard and finally spotted my name card. It had been placed on a tiny, wobbly, round cocktail table in the far corner of the yard, half hidden behind a massive potted hedge. It was situated right next to the stone pathway where the catering staff was carrying dirty dishes back to the kitchen. I was 30 years old, a grown man who commanded boardrooms in Manhattan, and they had banished me to the kids' table next to the trash. Just as I reached my little table, Julian walked past, holding a glass of scotch. He stopped, feigning surprise, and put on a look of deep, fake pity. "Oh, man," Julian said, shaking his head. "Elijah, I'm so sorry. I think Carter wanted the main table to look balanced for the photographs. You know how Isabella is about aesthetics. They needed an even number. Don't take it personally, all right? I'm just glad you made it." I stared at Julian. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing the middleman, kissing up to my mother and Carter to ensure he stayed in their good graces, probably hoping for a handout. "I'm sure the photographs will be beautiful, Julian," I said coldly. He blinked, unaccustomed to me not taking the bait, and scurried away. I sat down at my isolated table. A few minutes later, an old high school friend of Carter's, a guy named Marcus, strutted by. Marcus had always been a bully, a guy who peaked in high school and now rode Carter's coattails. He leaned over my table with a smug, oily grin. "Hey, Elijah," Marcus sneered. "Still fetching coffee for the big guys in New York? Carter tells me you're basically a glorified assistant these days. Listen, let me know if you need a real job. Carter and I are going to be running a massive operation soon. I'm sure he could find a spot for you in the mailroom. Family takes care of family, right?" I didn't break eye contact. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him with the same detached clinical interest I used when reviewing a bankrupt company's assets. "I'm doing just fine, Marcus. Enjoy the free alcohol while it lasts." Marcus scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. I sat there alone for over an hour, watching my family celebrate a life I was explicitly excluded from. The only person who showed me a shred of human decency was an older man working the catering staff, a chef whose name tag read Thomas. He noticed me sitting alone by the dish return. He quietly walked over, carrying a plate of hot, perfectly cooked steak and a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon. "You look like you've had a long drive, sir," Thomas said kindly, setting the plate down. "It gets loud out there. Enjoy the quiet." I thanked him genuinely. It was a tiny gesture, but that chef showed me more respect in 10 seconds than my own mother had in 30 years. Later in the evening, I decided to stretch my legs. I walked toward the outdoor bar near the edge of the patio. That is when I overheard Arthur Sterling holding court with a group of men, including my father, Carter, and Marcus. Arthur was a loud, red-faced, barrel-chested man who clearly loved the sound of his own voice. He was holding a thick cigar, laughing loudly at his own jokes. I stood in the shadows near a trellis, out of sight, and listened. "I'm telling you, Richard, this merger is going to put Sterling Logistics on the map globally," Arthur bragged, slapping my father on the back. My father just nodded along meekly. "My future son-in-law here, Carter, is going to step in as the vice president of operations. We are securing a $50 million capital injection from Mercer Holdings. $50 million. It's basically a done deal." Carter puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of a victory he hadn't even earned. "We are just waiting on the final signature from their operations director," Carter said smoothly, taking a sip of his drink. "Some guy who goes by the initials EH. My lawyers say he is notoriously difficult, a real stickler for the rules, but Arthur's legal team has assured us they've greased the right wheels. He's going to sign off by Monday morning." I froze in my tracks. The glass of sparkling water in my hand suddenly felt very cold. My heart started pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew Arthur Sterling's company. I knew it intimately. For the past 3 months, my team and I had been tearing apart his financial records. His logistics company was a crumbling house of cards, built on massive hidden debt, shell corporations, and severe unethical labor practices in their overseas warehouses. The lawyers had been hounding my office relentlessly, begging for a meeting with H, offering lavish gifts and hinting at bribes, doing everything they could to bypass my risk assessment. And I had a thick red file sitting on the center of my desk in New York, ready to be stamped with a massive "rejected" on Monday morning. I watched Carter smile, completely oblivious to his impending ruin. My golden boy brother was marrying into a sinking ship, and he thought he was climbing aboard a luxury yacht. He thought the money was guaranteed. He thought Mercer Holdings was going to hand him $50 million to play with. He had absolutely no idea that the man who held the keys to the vault, the terrifying they were all whispering about, was standing 10 feet away, drinking water out of a plastic cup. Carter suddenly turned his head and noticed me standing near the trellis. He whispered something in Arthur's ear, and they both walked over to me. Isabella, poured into a tight, incredibly expensive designer dress, followed closely behind them. As she walked, she raised her left hand to brush her hair back, and the patio lights caught the brilliant flash of a diamond. My grandmother's diamond. The ring I had bought back with my blood and sweat. "Elijah," Carter said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I see you found your little table back there. Listen, Arthur and I were just talking. Once the new capital comes in next week, we are going to be expanding the headquarters. I know you're stuck doing administrative work right now, answering phones and all that, but I could probably talk to the HR department and get you an interview for a low-level management spot. We believe in helping family." Isabella let out a sharp, unpleasant laugh. "Oh, Carter, you are too generous. But we really need people with actual corporate business experience, honey. Elijah might be a bit out of his depth in a real office." I looked at Isabella's sneering face, then at Carter's arrogant smirk, and finally at Arthur Sterling, who was puffing on his cigar like he owned the world. I felt a profound, chilling calm wash over me. The anger, the hurt, the childhood trauma. It all vanished, replaced by cold, hard clarity. I wasn't the victim here. I was the one holding the executioner's axe. "I appreciate the offer, Carter," I said slowly, making sure my voice was perfectly steady, my eyes locking onto his. "But I think you should wait until the Mercer money actually clears the bank before you start handing out charity jobs." Arthur Sterling frowned, pulling the cigar from his mouth. He looked at me like I was a bug on his shoe. The money is secure, young man. You don't know the first thing about high-level corporate finance. Stick to making copies. I just smiled a small, tight, genuine smile. We'll see. I turned and walked away, heading back toward the main patio as the sky turned pitch black. The air felt heavy, thick with the promise of a storm. The final act of this miserable family play was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how I was going to rewrite the ending. The party naturally gravitated toward the edge of the large, illuminated swimming pool as the time for speeches approached. Waiters expertly navigated through the crowd, handing out fresh crystal flutes of champagne. I stood near the back, leaning against a cool stone pillar, watching the spectacle unfold. My mother, Denise, stepped up to a small microphone they had set up near the water's edge. She tapped a silver spoon against her glass, demanding the absolute attention of every guest in the yard. She looked radiant, playing the role of the perfect, loving matriarch with terrifying precision. Family, my mother began, her voice trembling with perfectly practiced emotion. Family is knowing who belongs in your life and protecting what matters most. She paused, letting the guests murmur in agreement. When I look at my son Carter and his beautiful Isabella, I see the future. I see success, I see beauty, and most importantly, I see a legacy. Richard and I have always raised Carter to understand the value of hard work, loyalty, and tradition. And seeing him give Isabella my dear mother's antique diamond ring, well, it just proves that he is a man who honors our history, a man who sacrifices for the people he loves. I felt my jaw clench so tightly I thought my teeth would crack. A vein throbbed in my temple. She was standing there, in front of 100 people, taking the ultimate sacrifice I had made, the money I had bled for, the ring I had rescued from a pawn shop, and wrapping it up like a shiny gift for my brother to claim as his own. I looked across the crowd and locked eyes with my Aunt Martha. Martha knew the truth. She was the only other person who knew I had bought that ring back. But the moment my eyes met hers, she quickly looked down at her expensive shoes, too cowardly, too afraid of my mother's wrath to ever speak up and defend me. My mother wiped a delicate, fake tear from the corner of her eye, careful not to smudge her makeup. The crowd clapped enthusiastically. Arthur Sterling raised his glass high in the air and shouted, "To the future of Sterling Logistics and the new family." Carter beamed, looking like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. Then, the hired photographer stepped forward, clapping his hands loudly to corral the guests. "All right, everyone, beautiful speeches. Now, before we lose the lighting, let's get the immediate family together for some formal portraits right here by the water. I need Richard, Denise, Carter, Isabella, and Arthur right here in the center. Let's make it tight. Everyone smile." People started shuffling around, making room for the VIPs. I took a slow, deep breath, pushed myself off the stone pillar, and began walking toward the group. I didn't want to be in their picture. I hated being near them. Every fiber of my being wanted to walk out the front door. But I was Carter's older brother. I was immediate family. If I didn't walk up there, it would cause whispers among the guests. I was just trying to do the polite thing, to fulfill the bare minimum requirement of my bloodline. As I stepped into the bright, harsh glare of the camera's lighting umbrellas, my mother saw me approaching. Her perfect, glowing smile vanished instantly. Her eyes widened in a sudden, visceral panic. She quickly stepped away from Carter and intercepted me before I could reach the edge of the group. She reached out and grabbed my upper arm. Her manicured fingernails dug painfully through the fabric of my suit jacket, pinching my skin. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed under her breath, her face inches from mine. Her breath smelled of champagne and mints. "I am getting in the family photo," I said quietly, keeping my face neutral for the guests watching us. "No, you are not," she snapped, her voice trembling with a sudden vicious rage. "You are ruining the aesthetic. Look at your suit. Look at your face, you look miserable. This picture is going to the society pages, Elijah. You don't belong in this picture. You don't belong here. Go sit down at your table." I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm like a vice. In that split second, a montage of my entire life flashed before my eyes. I thought about the stolen college fund. I thought about the lonely holidays spent eating takeout in my cramped apartment. I thought about the antique diamond ring sparkling on Isabella's finger. The years of swallowing my pride, the years of shrinking myself to make them comfortable, the years of accepting their disrespect. It all hit a massive boiling point. The dam broke. For the first time in my 30 years of life, I did not retreat. "I am his brother," I said, my voice rising just enough for the people standing nearby to hear. "I am standing in this photograph. Let go of me," I added, pulling my arm forcefully out of her painful grip. My mother panicked. She saw the photographer looking confused, lowering his camera. She saw Arthur Sterling raising an eyebrow at the commotion. She felt her perfect, rigidly controlled environment slipping through her fingers. In a moment of pure, unhinged desperation to get me out of the frame, to literally erase me from the picture, she lunged forward and shoved me. She didn't just push me away. She planted both of her hands squarely on my chest and shoved with all her body weight. Because I was standing right on the edge of the pool, near the slick, wet stones, my leather dress shoes had absolutely no traction. My arms flailed wildly in the air as my center of gravity shifted backward violently. I saw the dark night sky spin above me. I saw the shocked faces of the guests. And then, the cold, heavy water slammed up to meet me. The impact knocked the wind out of me, plunging me into the silent blue depths. When I finally broke the surface, gasping and wiping the water from my eyes, the sound that greeted me wasn't horror. It was the laughter, Carter's smirk, Isabella's giggles, my mother's cold, relieved glare. I placed my hands on the edge of the pool to hoist myself out, the humiliation burning in my chest like a physical fire. But then, the heavy, unmistakable sound of a high-end engine purring cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Headlights swept across the manicured lawn. The massive, black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided down the private driveway, stopping right near the open patio gates. The laughter died in people's throats. Everyone turned to look. The driver's door opened, and a massive man in a dark suit stepped out. He walked around to the back door and pulled it open. And out stepped Daniel Mercer. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He exuded the kind of quiet, terrifying authority that didn't require raising a voice. He didn't look at the extravagant decorations. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, bypassing Arthur Sterling, who was already running toward him like a desperate puppy. Daniel's eyes landed directly on the pool. He saw me, soaking wet, pulling myself out of the water onto the cold concrete. The silence in the backyard was absolute. Daniel Mercer bypassed Arthur, walked straight through the crowd of frozen guests, and stopped right at the edge of the pool. He looked down at me. Then he unbuttoned his suit jacket, took it off and held it out to me. "Are you all right, Elijah?" Daniel asked, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the yard. I took a deep breath, water dripping from my chin, and looked up into the eyes of the billionaire. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said evenly. "Just a little misunderstanding about where I belong." Daniel's eyes narrowed dangerously as he looked slowly at Carter, and then at my mother. "We'll see about that," he said. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the pool, his presence commanding the absolute attention of every single person in that sprawling backyard. The laughter that had been directed at me just seconds prior had completely evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. He was holding his custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket out to me. The heavy, cold water from my ruined clothes was dripping continuously onto the pristine stone patio, pooling in dark, messy circles around my leather shoes. I slowly reached out, my hands shaking just slightly from the adrenaline, the betrayal, and the chill of the night air, and I slipped my arms into his jacket. It was warm. It was heavy. Right then, wrapping that expensive fabric around my soaking wet shoulders felt like putting on an impenetrable suit of armor. The entire backyard was frozen in time. You really have to picture this scene to understand the sheer magnitude of the shift in power. Over 100 of the wealthiest people in our town, the country club elite, the people my mother worshipped and feared, were standing completely paralyzed. My mother, Denise, had her hand hovering near her mouth, her perfect posture suddenly looking incredibly brittle and small. Carter's arrogant, mocking smirk had completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of absolute, blank confusion. He looked like a child who had just dropped his ice cream on the sidewalk. Arthur Sterling was the very first person to break the spell. His corporate survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He pushed his way roughly through the crowd of frozen guests. His face flushed an unnatural, panicked shade of red. Sweat was instantly beading on his wide forehead. He practically sprinted toward Daniel Mercer, almost tripping over a decorative planter in his haste. He had his right hand outstretched, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing right next to the billionaire, shivering and dripping wet. "Mr. Mercer! Mr. Mercer, sir!" Arthur shouted, his loud voice cracking with desperate, embarrassing excitement. "I am Arthur Sterling. We have been trying to coordinate a meeting with your office in New York for months now. My lead lawyer has sent dozens of formal requests. I am so unbelievably honored you came to my daughter's engagement party tonight. This is my future son-in-law, Carter. We are the core management team behind Sterling Logistics." Arthur was completely breathless. He looked like a man begging for his life, which, in the high-stakes corporate financial world, he absolutely was. He thought Daniel Mercer was here to bless the marriage and the business merger. He thought he had won the lottery. Daniel Mercer did not reach out to shake his hand. He did not even look at Arthur's face right away. He just slowly, deliberately turned his head and stared down at Arthur's outstretched, sweaty hand as if it were a piece of rotting garbage resting on the sidewalk. The silence stretched out, agonizing and sharp. Arthur awkwardly, slowly pulled his hand back, wiping his palm on his expensive slacks. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Sterling," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, incredibly calm, and completely devoid of warmth, but it carried across the dead-silent yard like the crack of a whip. "And I know exactly why your corporate lawyer has been relentlessly harassing my staff. You are drowning in toxic debt, Arthur, and you are desperately looking for a $50 million lifeline from my firm to save your sinking ship." Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his thick throat. The color started to drain from his face. "Sir, I assure you, our financial projections for the next quarter are completely solid. The market is just experiencing a temporary shift. If we could just get a formal meeting with your executive director of strategic operations, the man your office calls EH. If I could just sit down with him for 5 minutes, I can explain the numbers. I can prove our long-term value." Daniel finally looked Arthur directly in the eye. A cold, terrifying, predatory smile touched the corner of the billionaire's mouth. "You do not need to schedule a meeting with him, Arthur," Daniel said smoothly, the absolute authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. "He is standing right in front of you." Arthur blinked heavily. He looked around the yard, his eyes darting back and forth in confusion. He looked at Carter. He looked at my mother. Finally, his eyes slowly dragged back to me. He looked at my wet, plastered hair, my ruined, soaking wet suit, and Daniel Mercer's expensive jacket draped protectively over my shoulders. His brain simply refused to process the information. It defied his entire worldview. "I do not understand," Arthur stammered, his loud, booming voice reduced to a pathetic, breathy whisper. "Elijah," Daniel said, turning his body completely toward me, his tone shifting instantly from disdain for Arthur to one of absolute professional respect for me. "Would you care to explain the current status of the Sterling Logistics investment file to Mr. Sterling?" I took a deliberate step forward. The cold night air hit my wet face, but I had never felt more awake, more intensely alive, in my entire 30 years of existence. I looked directly into Arthur Sterling's terrified, wide eyes. Then I shifted my gaze to my brother, Carter, whose face had drained of all color, making him look like a ghost standing under the patio lights. "The file is dead, Arthur," I said, my voice ringing out clearly, echoing over the surface of the swimming pool. I am the Executive Director of Strategic Operations for Mercer Holdings. And for the past 3 agonizing months, my investigative team and I have been tearing your logistics company apart piece by piece. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the wealthy guests. My mother took a staggering step back, her high heel catching awkwardly on the edge of a paving stone. She almost lost her balance. Carter's jaw literally dropped open. He tried to form a word, he tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. I did not stop. I let 30 years of being the invisible, unloved, disrespected son fuel every single syllable that left my mouth. You wanted $50 million of our capital, I continued, taking another step closer to Arthur, forcing him to look up at me. But my comprehensive audit found your hidden offshore accounts. We found the massive, undeclared liabilities you tried to bury in shell companies. We found the severe, unethical labor practices in your Southeast Asian warehouses that you desperately tried to hide under fake ledger entries. Your entire company is a fraud, Arthur. It is a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. And I do not throw Mercer Holdings money into a black hole. The deal is rejected. I personally stamped it rejected last Tuesday. Arthur's face went from pale to a sickly, ash-gray color. His heavy chest heaved as he struggled for air, clutching the lapels of his own suit. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, you are a secretary. Carter told me you were an administrative assistant. He told me you fetched coffee and filed papers." I looked at my golden boy brother, who was now physically trembling, his hands shaking at his sides. "Carter says a lot of things to make himself look bigger, Arthur. He also stood here tonight and let my mother tell everyone in this yard that he bought his beautiful fiancée an antique diamond ring with his own hard-earned business profits. That was a lie, too. Carter hasn't earned a single dollar of his own in his entire life." Daniel Mercer stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a united, impenetrable front. "My firm operates on absolute trust, transparency, and integrity, Mr. Sterling," Daniel said to the crowd. "Elijah is my most trusted executive. He holds the keys to my vault. He told me this logistics deal was toxic garbage, and his word is the final law in my building. Furthermore, after personally witnessing the sheer lack of basic human decency displayed by this family in this yard tonight, I would not invest a single dime of my money in anyone associated with them. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The brutal, uncompromising reality of my words slammed into Arthur Sterling like a physical freight train. He stood there, frozen, as the horrifying truth washed over him. He realized, standing there in front of the entire town, in front of his peers and competitors, that his company was effectively dead. Mercer Holdings was the ultimate gold standard in the private equity world. If we publicly rejected a deal due to fraud and hidden liabilities, no other bank, no other venture capitalist, no other investor in the entire country would ever touch his business. He was completely, irrevocably ruined. Arthur spun around, his eyes blazing with absolute, unhinged fury, and charged directly toward my father and Carter. "You lied to me!" Arthur screamed at the top of his lungs, spit flying from his lips. His fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were pure white. "You told me you had an inside connection at Mercer. You told me your brilliant son was going to guarantee the funding for the merger. You set me up with a complete fraud. You tied my family to a sinking ship. Arthur, please, I am begging you. Let's calm down and talk about this inside." My father pleaded, raising his trembling hands, absolutely terrified of the public conflict and the scene it was causing. "We honestly did not know. Elijah never told us his actual salary or his corporate title. We thought he was just doing entry-level work. You thought? Arthur roared, cutting my father off, his voice echoing off the back of the large house. I am going into bankruptcy. My remaining investors are going to pull out by Monday morning when the news of this rejection hits the financial wire. And you? He pointed a thick, trembling, furious finger directly at Carter's chest, poking him hard. You are nothing but a useless, spoiled little boy playing dress-up with your daddy's credit cards. The wedding is completely off. The corporate partnership is dead. You will never see my daughter again. Isabella, standing a few feet away, let out a piercing, dramatic scream that shattered the remaining tension. Dad, no. You cannot do this. The invitations are already sent. The venue is booked. My friends are coming. Arthur grabbed his daughter's arm roughly, pulling her toward him. Take that ring off your finger right now, Isabella. We are leaving this instant. I am not tying my name or my family to these pathetic liars. Isabella looked at Carter. She looked at his pale, terrified, completely pathetic face. He did not say a word to defend her. He did not step forward to protect their relationship. The harsh realization finally dawned on her that Carter had no real money. There was no $50 million deal, and there was absolutely no wealthy, luxurious future waiting for her. With a disgusted, angry sob, she ripped the antique diamond ring off her finger and threw it as hard as she could onto the stone patio. The ring bounced twice, the sharp, distinct sound of precious metal hitting hard stone ringing clearly in the silent yard, before rolling and stopping right near the toe of my wet leather shoes. Arthur and Isabella stormed through the crowd, heading straight for the side gate and the front driveway. Elijah, she cried, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered desperation. Elijah, please, you cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood. Tell Mr. Mercer you made a terrible mistake. Tell him you will review the file again on Monday. Please do it for your brother. Carter needs this money. Our family needs this connection. I looked down at the ground. I slowly crouched down, the wet fabric of my trousers sticking uncomfortably to my knees, and picked up the antique diamond ring. I rolled the cold metal between my thumb and forefinger, looking at the stone that had caused so much silent, invisible pain in my life. I stood back up, clutching the ring in my palm, and looked my mother dead in the eye. Family, I said, my voice dangerously soft, repeating the word she loved to use as a weapon against me. You stood in front of all these people tonight and praised Carter for buying this ring. You told everyone he sacrificed his own business profits for it. You made him the hero. I turned slightly to face the remaining guests, raising my voice so everyone could clearly hear the unvarnished truth. 7 years ago, when this family was on the verge of losing this exact house, my mother took my grandmother's ring and pawned it just to keep up appearances. I was 23 years old. I had just gotten my first real salary bonus working 80 hours a week in New York. I took that money, went to the pawn shop, and bought it back. I handed it to her to keep our history safe. And she stole that credit just like she stole my college fund to pay for Carter's frat parties. She gave my hard-earned money to the golden boy. I turned back to my mother. She was visibly shaking, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute, undeniable terror as her deepest, ugliest secrets were aired out to the exact people whose opinions she valued most in the world. I reached out, took her trembling hand, pried her stiff fingers open, and pressed the cold diamond ring firmly into her palm. Keep the ring, Mother, I said, my voice completely devoid of any anger or sadness. It was just empty. Consider it my final payment. The debt of my birth is paid in full. I do not owe you anything. I do not owe Carter anything. I am completely, finally done with you. I did not wait for her response. I did not look at my father, who was staring blankly at his shoes, entirely defeated. I did not look at Carter, who was crying silently by the empty, ruined head table. I simply turned my back on all of them. Daniel Mercer placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. Let's go home, Elijah. You have a massive board meeting on Monday, and I need my best man sharp. We walked together across the lawn. The crowd of wealthy guests literally parted for us like the Red Sea. I climbed into the back of the warm, leather-scented Rolls-Royce. The heavy door shut with a solid, satisfying click, completely cutting off the chaotic, pathetic sounds of the backyard. As the car pulled out of the driveway and onto the main road, heading back toward the city, I did not look back out the window. Not even once. 2 months passed. In the fast-paced, cutthroat corporate world of New York City, 2 months is more than enough time to completely bury a legacy and tear down a fraudulent empire. The fallout from that disastrous night by the pool was absolute, swift, and completely merciless. Arthur Sterling's logistics company officially filed for bankruptcy just 3 weeks later. The news of Mercer Holdings rejecting their funding hit the financial sector hard. Without our bailout to act as a shield, his aggressive creditors swarmed his remaining assets like sharks smelling blood in the water. Arthur spent his days in courtrooms, screaming at a lawyer he could no longer afford to pay. The Grand Society wedding, obviously, remained permanently canceled. I heard through the grapevine that Isabella quickly moved down to Miami and was already engaged to a much older, incredibly wealthy real estate developer. She landed on her feet as people like her always do. My own family's world, however, completely unraveled at the seams. With the Sterling deal dead in the water, Carter lost his phantom vice president job. He had absolutely no income, no real skills, and no salary to speak of. But he was drowning in a mountain of high-interest credit card debt from trying to keep up with Isabella's lavish, demanding lifestyle. My parents had foolishly co-signed the expensive lease on his luxury downtown apartment, and when he inevitably defaulted on the massive monthly payments, the bank came aggressively after them. I heard from a former neighbor that my mother was quietly, desperately selling off her designer bags, her expensive shoes, and her jewelry online just to keep the lights on in that massive, empty suburban house. The wealthy country club friends she had sacrificed my mental health for, the women she had tried to impress by pushing me into a swimming pool, they stopped returning her calls entirely. In their superficial, status-obsessed world, financial ruin is a contagious disease, and my mother was patient zero. She was completely isolated. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I received the final piece of the puzzle regarding my family's betrayal. I was sitting in my corner office in Manhattan, reviewing a new tech acquisition, when my personal phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was a large audio file sent from my 18-year-old cousin, Chloe. Chloe was the only person in that entire extended family who had ever looked at me with genuine sympathy, though she was always too young and too afraid of my mother's terrifying temper to ever speak up and defend me. The text message attached to the audio file simply read, "Elijah, I thought you should know the absolute truth about the seating chart at the party. I filmed this from the hallway when they didn't know I was there. I am so sorry I didn't say anything sooner. You didn't deserve any of it." I put in my wireless earbuds and hit play. The audio was slightly muffled, clearly taken from a phone hidden in a pocket or behind a door, but the voices were unmistakable. It was my cousin Julian, talking to my mother on the afternoon of the engagement party, hours before I even arrived. "Aunt Denise, seriously, do not worry about Elijah tonight," Julian's voice sneered through my phone speaker. "I already took care of it. I moved his name card to the back cocktail table near the kitchen doors. He won't be in the way of the Sterling family photos. I know you hate having him around when important people are here. He always looks so gloomy and brings the mood down. Listen, Aunt Denise, speaking of the party and helping out, I was wondering if we could talk about that small loan I asked you for, just to tide me over." I stopped the recording. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed in my quiet office. Julian, the self-proclaimed family peacemaker, the guy who called me practically crying, begging me to come down for the sake of the family, telling me how much my mother missed me. He had purposely lured me there, intentionally isolated me, and set me up for public humiliation just to suck up to my mother for a quick cash handout. I didn't get angry. Anger is a useless, exhausting emotion. I got efficient. I took that raw audio file and dropped it directly into the massive family group chat that I had kept on mute for 7 years. I didn't add a long, dramatic, emotional message. I didn't explain myself or demand an apology. I just sent the audio file and watched the read receipts immediately roll in across the screen. The group chat exploded within seconds. Julian tried to send a frantic, poorly spelled excuse claiming it was taken out of context. My aunts started demanding answers, asking how he could do that to his own cousin, calling him a manipulative liar. My mother, predictably, went completely cowardly silent. She had nothing left to say. I opened the chat settings, tapped Leave Group, and proceeded to permanently block every single phone number associated with my blood relatives. It felt like taking a deep, fulfilling breath of clean air after being trapped in a dusty, suffocating room for 30 years. It felt like cutting a heavy, rusting iron anchor from around my neck. I was finally free. A sharp knock on my heavy glass office door pulled me out of my thoughts. It was Sarah, my fiercely loyal senior assistant, followed closely by the rest of my strategic operations team. Sarah was holding a small, elegant chocolate cake with a single bright candle burning in the center. Walking quietly behind the team was Daniel Mercer himself, looking remarkably relaxed. Daniel stepped into my office, holding a thick, leather-bound folder. He walked over and placed it firmly on the center of my desk. "The executive board voted this morning, Elijah," Daniel said, his usually stern, unreadable face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "It was unanimous. Congratulations on the massive promotion. You are officially the new Vice President of Global Strategy for Mercer Holdings. You earned every single piece of this." Sarah handed me a slice of the cake on a small paper plate, beaming with absolute pride. My team clapped enthusiastically. They stepped forward one by one, shaking my hand, telling me how much they had learned from my leadership, how much they respected the way I handled the immense pressure of the corporate world, and how I always had their backs when the corporate politics got nasty. I stood there in my tailored suit, looking around that bright, modern, beautiful room. I looked at these brilliant, hardworking, honest people who valued me for my mind, for my relentless dedication, and for my character. I wasn't an outcast here. I wasn't a disappointment. I wasn't the punchline to a cruel joke. I realized right then and there that shared blood does not automatically make a family. Respect, loyalty, and fighting side by side in the trenches of life, that is what makes a family. I had finally found my true place in the world, and the absolute best part was, I did not have to shrink myself down or apologize for my success to fit into it. Later that same night, I stood completely alone by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment. The city of New York stretched out infinitely below me, a glowing, pulsing grid of endless possibilities. The traffic moved like rivers of yellow and red light far beneath my feet, silent through the thick glass. It was completely quiet up here, peaceful, the kind of peace you only achieve after surviving a war. I pulled my personal phone out of my pocket and opened the settings. Out of morbid curiosity, a desire to close the final chapter of my past, I checked my blocked messages folder. There were dozens of voicemails sitting there in the dark, waiting to be heard. I listened to the first few seconds of a few. There was one from Carter, his voice thick with pathetic tears, desperately apologizing for laughing at me, asking if I could just forgive him and maybe introduce him to some of my corporate contacts, just to get him an entry-level interview somewhere so he wouldn't face eviction. There were several from my mother, leaving long, rambling, hysterical messages about how a mother's love is supposed to be unconditional, about how families need to forgive each other's mistakes, and how she was just under so much intense social stress that night at the pool and didn't mean to push me. She even cried about the inheritance, begging me to remember the good times we supposedly had. She still couldn't admit the absolute truth. She wasn't sorry for how she treated me. She was only sorry because I had power, and because she was facing the brutal consequences of her own vanity. I didn't listen to the rest of the messages. I highlighted the entire folder, selected all the voicemails, and hit delete. Gone. Erased. Permanently removed from my life. For 30 long years, I truly believed that my greatest tragedy in life was not being loved by the people who brought me into this world. I thought I was fundamentally broken because no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much of my salary I sacrificed to fix their mistakes, I couldn't earn their basic approval. But as I stood there, looking out over the incredible city I had conquered with my own 2 hands, I realized the absolute truth. Their rejection wasn't a punishment. It was a brutal, necessary form of protection. It forced me to walk into the fire completely alone, and that fire forged me into titanium. When you finally stop exhausting yourself trying to belong in a room that actively wants you to fail, you realize you have the power and the freedom to go out and build your own castle. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's not easy opening up about the darkest, most painful parts of your past, but I felt like I really had to share this. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect you are the exact ones you have to protect yourself from. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, fighting endlessly for respect from the people who should have given it freely? Let me know down in the comments. And hey, if you made it all the way to the very end of this video, I want you to comment the letter W down below. W stands for winner. That's our secret code. It's the sign to recognize the 1% club, the amazing people who don't just click away when things get deep, the ones who stay for the whole journey. Seeing those W's in the comments lets me know I'm not just speaking into a void. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the channel so we can keep sharing these stories together. Until next time, keep fighting for your worth, and never, ever let anyone put you at the back table.